The world often believes that glory is loud. It imagines triumph as flashing cameras, thunderous applause, trophies raised high under blinding lights, and headlines written in bold letters. Yet the truth Keanu Reeves had learned long before fame ever found him was far quieter. Real strength, he knew, usually lived in the shadows, unseen and uncelebrated. It was forged in moments when no one was watching, when doing the right thing came at a cost no award could ever repay. And on a day when the entire industry expected him to choose glory, Keanu Reeves chose something else entirely. He chose pain, he chose silence, and he chose to protect Sandra Bullock. The decision did not arrive suddenly. It had been building for weeks, perhaps even years, shaped by long conversations, shared laughter, unspoken understanding, and a mutual respect that never needed to be explained. Keanu and Sandra had worked together before, and the connection they shared was the kind that did not demand attention. It was steady, rooted in trust rather than spectacle. In an industry that thrived on gossip and exaggerated narratives, their bond existed quietly, untouched by the noise. That was precisely why the moment felt so heavy when the storm finally arrived. The project that brought them together again was already surrounded by intense anticipation. Studios were competing, critics were circling, and the media had crafted its own story long before a single scene was shot. Keanu, known for his humility, was once again being positioned as the centerpiece, the figure everyone expected to carry the film to greatness. Sandra, equally respected but fiercely private, was navigating her own pressures. The stakes were enormous, and with them came expectations that felt less like opportunities and more like traps. It began with whispers, a careless comment taken out of context, a fabricated narrative that twisted kindness into something suspicious. Anonymous sources appeared overnight, each one claiming insight, each one pushing the story further from the truth. The headlines did what they always did best. They simplified complex human relationships into clickable drama. Sandra felt it immediately. She had lived long enough under the public eye to recognize when a story was no longer harmless chatter, but something capable of causing real damage. Keanu saw it too, though he reacted differently. Where others might have rushed to defend themselves publicly, he grew quieter. He listened. He observed. He understood that sometimes the loudest response only fed the fire. What concerned him most was not his own reputation. He had learned long ago that fame was fleeting and opinions changed with the wind. What mattered to him was the weight the narrative placed on Sandra, the way it invaded her sense of safety, her dignity, and her peace. Late one evening, after a long day on set, they found themselves sitting across from each other in a quiet corner, the noise of the world temporarily shut out. Sandra's smile was present, but it carried a fatigue that Keanu recognized instantly. It was the look of someone who had spent too much energy pretending everything was fine. He did not ask questions. He did not offer advice. He simply sat there, offering what he always had, presence without pressure. "I've been here before," Sandra said finally, her voice steady but low. "You think you're prepared for it, and then one headline changes everything." Keanu nodded. He knew that feeling well. He had faced loss, tragedy, and public scrutiny in ways few people ever truly understood. Pain had been a familiar companion in his life, but it had also been his teacher. It had shown him what mattered and what never would. "They don't get to decide who you are," he replied quietly. "They never have." Sandra looked at him, really looked at him, as if measuring the weight of his words. In that moment, she did not see a global star or an industry icon. She saw a man who had learned how to stand still in the middle of chaos, a man who understood that strength was not about control, but about choice. What neither of them said aloud was that the situation was escalating faster than anyone expected. The studio had begun to panic. Investors were nervous. Publicists were drafting statements filled with empty reassurances. And behind closed doors, there were conversations about damage control that felt less like solutions and more like sacrifices waiting to happen. The unspoken solution soon revealed itself. Someone needed to take responsibility. Someone needed to redirect the narrative, to absorb the criticism, to become the focal point of the storm so that it would no longer circle Sandra. The implication was clear, even if no one dared say it outright. If Keanu distanced himself publicly, if he accepted the blame, if he allowed the story to frame him as the problem, the pressure on Sandra would ease. It was a cruel calculation, but it was how the system worked. Keanu was offered alternatives, carefully worded statements that subtly shifted blame without appearing cruel, opportunities to step back temporarily while maintaining his image. even a suggestion that the project could continue without him, preserving his reputation while minimizing risk. On paper, these options looked reasonable. They were designed to protect his career, his future, his legacy. But Keanu had never measured his life by those standards. He spent a long night alone, walking through quiet streets, listening to the sound of his own footsteps echo against empty sidewalks. He thought about everything he had lost and everything he had survived. He thought about the people who had stood by him when he had nothing to offer in return. And he thought about Sandra not as a co-star or a headline, but as a human being deserving of respect and peace. By morning, his decision was already made. When the announcement came, it shocked everyone. Keanu Reeves stepped away from the project, citing personal responsibility and a desire to protect the integrity of the film. He did not defend himself. He did not clarify the rumors. He did not shift blame. He accepted the narrative as it was being told, fully aware of what it would cost him. The backlash was immediate. Critics questioned his judgment. Commentators speculated endlessly. Social media exploded with opinions, many of them harsh, some of them cruel. Opportunities quietly disappeared. Invitations stopped coming. The industry, which had once celebrated him, now watched from a distance, uncertain of what to make of his choice. Sandra watched it all unfold with a heaviness she could not put into words. She knew what he had done. She understood the price he was paying, and she also knew that there was nothing she could say publicly that would not make things worse. Gratitude in that moment had to remain private. They spoke briefly, away from cameras and microphones. "You didn't have to do this," she said, her voice trembling despite her effort to keep it steady. Keanu met her gaze without hesitation. "Yes," he replied gently, "I did." It was not a declaration of heroism. It was a statement of truth. For Keanu, protecting someone who mattered was never a sacrifice. It was a responsibility he accepted without resentment. The weeks that followed were some of the quietest of his career. The world moved on, as it always did, chasing the next story, the next controversy. But for Keanu, the silence was not empty. It was filled with reflection, with pain that had been chosen deliberately, and with a strange sense of peace that came from knowing he had not betrayed his own values. Sandra, meanwhile, slowly found her footing again. The pressure eased. The headlines softened. The narrative shifted, as narratives always do. She returned to her work with a renewed sense of purpose, carrying with her a private understanding of what true support looked like. What the world never fully realized was that Keanu's choice did more than protect a single person. It challenged the very idea of what success meant. It reminded those watching closely that character was revealed not in moments of applause, but in moments of loss. That kindness, when practiced quietly, could be more powerful than any public victory. This was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning of a journey shaped by resilience, empathy, and a bond tested not by fame, but by sacrifice. And as the world continued to chase glory, Keanu Reeves walked a different path, carrying the quiet knowledge that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is choose pain, so that someone else does not have to. The silence that followed his sacrifice, the silence that came after Keanu Reeves stepped away from the project, was not the peaceful kind. It was heavy, layered with unanswered questions, industry judgment, and the kind of uncertainty that presses against a person's chest in the quiet hours of the night. For the world, it was just another headline that would eventually fade. For Keanu, it was a season of deliberate isolation, a time when the absence of applause forced him to confront truths that fame had long tried to drown out. He had chosen pain over glory, and now he was living inside that choice day by day, without regret but not without consequence. Mornings came slower than they used to. Without the rigid schedule of sets, rehearsals, and meetings, time stretched in unfamiliar ways. Keanu filled those hours with routine, not because he needed distraction, but because routine grounded him. He walked the same streets at dawn, when the city was still half asleep, watching shopkeepers lift their shutters and commuters clutch warm cups of coffee. There was comfort in being unseen, in moving through the world without expectations attached to his name. Yet beneath that calm exterior, there was a quiet ache, not for the opportunities he had lost, but for the way the story had been allowed to stand, incomplete and unfair. The industry's response was subtle but unmistakable. Scripts that once arrived weekly slowed to a trickle. Conversations that used to feel warm became polite and distant. People spoke carefully around him, as if his choice were contagious, as if standing too close to someone who had rejected the system might cost them something as well. Keanu noticed it all, but he did not internalize it as bitterness. He understood fear. He understood how rare it was for people to choose principle when comfort was within reach. Sandra Bullock experienced the aftermath differently. While the storm around her name had eased, the relief came with its own weight. She returned to work, attended meetings, and smiled for cameras, but the knowledge of what Keanu had endured for her sake followed her everywhere. Gratitude mixed with guilt, and neither emotion could be expressed openly without reigniting the very narrative they had worked so hard to escape. In public, she remained composed. In private, she wrestled with the reality that someone else had carried a burden meant for both of them. They did not speak often during that time, not because distance had grown between them, but because both understood that words could complicate what silence protected. When they did talk, it was brief and ordinary, a message checking in, a quiet reassurance that the other was holding up. These small exchanges mattered more than grand declarations ever could. They were reminders that even in separation, trust remained intact. One evening, weeks after the decision, Keanu attended a small charity event without fanfare. It was the kind of gathering he had always favored, focused more on impact than attention. There, away from cameras and speculation, someone approached him not as a celebrity but as a human being. The conversation was simple, unremarkable on the surface, yet it lingered with him long after he returned home. The person spoke about courage, about how watching someone choose integrity over advancement had quietly changed the way they viewed their own life. There was no applause, no viral moment, just a sincere acknowledgement that his choice had rippled outward in ways he would never fully see. That realization stayed with him. Keanu had never believed that doing the right thing guaranteed visible rewards, but in that moment he felt something deeper than validation. He felt alignment. His actions matched his values, and that harmony carried a strength that no public recognition could replicate. Pain, he was learning, did not weaken him when it was chosen for the right reasons. It sharpened his sense of purpose. Sandra, meanwhile, faced her own reckoning. As the noise died down, she began to reflect on the industry she had navigated for decades. She thought about how often silence was demanded in exchange for survival, how frequently narratives were shaped without regard for truth. Keanu's sacrifice forced her to confront a difficult question. What did she owe to the people who stood beside her, and what did she owe to herself? The answer was not simple, but it pushed her toward a clarity she had been avoiding. Late one night, she sat alone, scrolling past old messages, old photos, reminders of moments when trust had been rare and fleeting. Keanu's presence in her life stood out not because of grand gestures, but because of consistency. He had never asked for anything in return. He had never leveraged their connection for advantage. And now, when it mattered most, he had chosen to step back rather than let her be diminished. That kind of loyalty, she realized, was not something to be quietly accepted. It was something to be honored, even if only through her own actions. The world, unaware of these internal shifts, continued to speculate. Some framed Keanu's silence as weakness. Others called it a strategic retreat. Very few considered the possibility that he had simply chosen to live with integrity rather than explain himself to people who were not listening. He did not correct them. He had learned that defending one's character often mattered less than embodying it consistently. As months passed, subtle changes began to appear. Conversations reopened. Doors that had quietly closed began to crack open again, not because the industry had suddenly become kinder, but because time had done what it always did. It revealed who remained steady when trends faded. Keanu returned to work slowly, deliberately, choosing projects that aligned with his values rather than his image. Each choice reinforced the lesson he had paid for with discomfort. Success without self-respect was a hollow victory. For Sandra, the shift was equally profound. She found herself speaking up more often, setting boundaries she once might have ignored. She approached her work with renewed intention, less willing to compromise her sense of self for approval. Though she never publicly addressed what had happened, those close to her noticed a change. There was a quiet strength in her decisions, a confidence rooted not in defiance, but in clarity. When they finally met again in person, there was no dramatic reunion, no emotional speeches or public acknowledgement. They sat together, sharing a simple meal, speaking about ordinary things, yet beneath the simplicity was an unspoken understanding that something fundamental had changed. Pain had been endured, lessons had been learned, and neither of them was the same person they had been before. What bound them now was not the past controversy, but the knowledge that character revealed itself under pressure. Keanu had chosen to protect rather than preserve his status. Sandra had learned what it meant to be truly supported without condition. Together, though not defined by the world's assumptions, they carried forward a shared truth. Resilience was not loud, and empathy did not need an audience. This chapter of their story was not about redemption or recognition. It was about endurance, about the quiet aftermath of a brave decision. And as both of them moved forward, the silence that once felt heavy began to transform into something else entirely, a space for growth, for healing, and for the kind of strength that only emerges when a person chooses what is right, even when it hurts. When pain became a quiet teacher, time did what it always did after a storm. It moved forward without asking permission. For Keanu Reeves, the days blended into one another, not in a blur of chaos, but in a slow, deliberate rhythm that forced him to confront himself without distraction. There were no premieres to prepare for, no rehearsals demanding his full attention, no schedules packed so tightly that reflection became impossible. Instead, there was space. And within that space, pain did not shout. It waited. It observed. And gradually, it began to teach. Keanu had never been afraid of solitude, but this period of his life carried a different texture. Solitude now came with awareness. He felt the absence of things others might have panicked over, the absence of validation, of constant reassurance that he was still wanted, still relevant, still admired. Yet what surprised him most was how little those absences hurt compared to the cost of compromising his values. Each morning, as he moved through simple routines, he recognized a steadiness within himself that fame had never given him. It was not happiness in the traditional sense, but it was something deeper, a calm acceptance of who he was becoming. The world, of course, had not stopped watching entirely. It never did. Articles still surfaced from time to time, speculating about his career, analyzing his choices as if they were puzzles meant to be solved. Some writers framed his silence as stubbornness. Others romanticized it as martyrdom. Keanu paid little attention to any of it. He understood now that people often projected their own fears onto the actions of others. His choice made them uncomfortable, because it challenged the belief that success must always come at the expense of compassion. Sandra Bullock, meanwhile, found herself standing at a crossroads she had not anticipated. The relative calm that followed the controversy gave her room to breathe, but it also stripped away excuses she had once leaned on. Without constant pressure, she was left alone with her thoughts, and they led her back again and again to the same realization. Silence could be protective, but it could also become a form of avoidance. She respected Keanu's decision to step back, yet she wrestled with the idea that gratitude alone was not enough. Growth, she felt, demanded action. She began making quieter changes first, declining projects that felt hollow, asking harder questions in meetings, refusing to be rushed into decisions that did not align with her sense of purpose. These choices did not make headlines, but they reshaped her relationship with her work. For the first time in a long while, she felt fully present in her own life, not just reacting to circumstances, but consciously shaping them. Though they remained largely apart, Keanu and Sandra were moving through parallel transformations. Each carried the imprint of the same experience, filtered through different lenses. Pain had not broken either of them, but it had stripped away illusions. It revealed which relationships were transactional and which were grounded in genuine respect. It exposed how easily systems rewarded compliance and how rarely they honored courage. One afternoon, Keanu visited a small community center that hosted workshops for young creatives. He had not planned to speak, but someone recognized him and asked if he would share a few words. Standing in front of a modest group without scripts or expectations, he spoke simply about resilience. He did not mention fame. He did not reference the controversy. He talked instead about listening to one's conscience and accepting the discomfort that often followed doing the right thing. His words were unpolished, honest, and deeply human. The room grew quiet, not from awe, but from recognition. As he left, a young artist thanked him, explaining how difficult it was to stay true to oneself in an environment that rewarded compromise. The conversation stayed with Keanu long after. He realized then that his experience, painful as it had been, carried meaning beyond his own life. It served as proof that integrity was not outdated, that choosing empathy over ambition could still matter in a world obsessed with outcomes. Sandra experienced her own moment of clarity during a private conversation with a trusted friend. As she spoke about the past months, the words surprised her with their honesty. She admitted how deeply Keanu's sacrifice had affected her, not because it made her feel indebted, but because it redefined what support looked like. It reminded her that true allies did not protect themselves at your expense. They protected you, even when it was inconvenient. That realization changed how she viewed her future. She no longer wanted to simply endure the industry. She wanted to engage with it on her own terms, with transparency and intention. While she remained careful not to reopen old wounds publicly, her private decisions spoke volumes. She chose projects that emphasized human connection, stories that highlighted perseverance rather than spectacle. In doing so, she honored the values that had been demonstrated so quietly on her behalf. Eventually, circumstances brought Keanu and Sandra back into the same space again, not under bright lights or flashing cameras, but in a setting defined by purpose rather than publicity. The moment was understated, yet it carried a weight neither of them ignored. They spoke at length, more openly than they had before, acknowledging the pain without dramatizing it, recognizing the growth without claiming victory. There was no need to revisit the past in detail. What mattered was the present understanding they now shared. Keanu spoke about what the silence had taught him, about how stepping away had clarified his priorities. Sandra listened with a depth that came from shared experience, not sympathy. When she spoke, she did so with gratitude that did not feel heavy or apologetic, but grounded and sincere. It was not a conversation of repayment. It was a conversation of mutual respect. What emerged between them was not a story the world could easily categorize. It was not about scandal or redemption or triumph over adversity. It was about evolution. Two people shaped by the same moment, choosing to carry its lessons forward rather than be defined by its pain. They understood now that resilience was not about enduring suffering quietly, nor was it about public declarations of strength. It was about learning, adapting, and remaining compassionate even after being tested. As they parted that day, there was no sense of closure in the traditional sense. Life, after all, did not wrap itself neatly around lessons learned. But there was something better: clarity. Keanu continued his path with renewed intention, no longer measuring success by visibility, but by alignment with his values. Sandra moved forward with confidence rooted in self-respect, guided by a deeper understanding of what truly mattered. Pain had been the teacher neither of them asked for, yet it had offered wisdom they would carry for years to come. And while the world remained largely unaware of the quiet transformations taking place, those changes shaped everything that followed. Because sometimes, the most powerful growth happens not when we win, but when we choose to lose something valuable in order to protect something priceless. The quiet return of purpose. The seasons changed almost unnoticed, as they often do when a person is no longer measuring time by premieres and deadlines. For Keanu Reeves, the shift from isolation to quiet re-engagement with the world happened gradually, without ceremony. There was no announcement marking his return, no calculated strategy to reclaim attention. Instead, purpose found him the same way it always had, softly, persistently, asking only that he remain honest with himself. The pain he had chosen months earlier no longer felt sharp. It had settled into something steady, like a reminder etched beneath the surface, guiding his steps rather than weighing them down. He began accepting work again, but with a discernment that surprised those who still watched from afar. Projects were no longer chosen for scale or prestige. He looked for stories that held humanity at their core, narratives that valued struggle without exploiting it, and hope without exaggeration. This approach did not align neatly with industry trends, but Keanu had stopped trying to fit into patterns that demanded parts of him he was unwilling to give. Each commitment felt intentional, grounded in a sense of responsibility to the stories he helped tell and the people who would receive them. What few people understood was that this return was not about reclaiming what he had lost. It was about expressing what he had gained. The experience of choosing pain had sharpened his empathy, making him more attentive to the unspoken struggles of those around him. On set, he listened more than he spoke. He noticed the quiet exhaustion in a crew member's posture, the nervous energy of a young actor finding their footing. His kindness was not performative. It was practical, offered in small gestures that eased the weight others carried. Those moments rarely reached public awareness, yet they defined his presence far more than any headline ever could. Sandra Bullock observed these changes from a distance at first, aware that time had reshaped both of them in ways neither could fully articulate. Her own journey toward purpose had been equally deliberate. The clarity she had gained did not push her toward louder expressions of independence, but toward quieter forms of integrity. She became more selective, not out of fear, but out of respect for herself and the audience she served. Every role she accepted carried intention, reflecting stories she believed deserved to be told. Though the industry continued to speculate about their connection, Sandra remained unmoved by external narratives. She had learned that public interpretation often said more about collective hunger for drama than about the truth of human relationships. What mattered to her was the internal compass she now trusted more deeply than ever. Keanu's sacrifice had not made her dependent. It had reminded her of the strength that came from mutual respect and shared values. That understanding became a quiet anchor in her life. When they crossed paths again professionally, it felt less like a reunion and more like a continuation of a conversation paused, not ended. There was ease in their interaction, a natural rhythm shaped by experience rather than expectation. They did not need to revisit the past or justify their choices. The understanding between them was evident in the way they listened to each other, in the absence of defensiveness, in the shared awareness that growth had taken place on both sides. Working together in this new chapter felt different. There was less urgency, less pressure to prove anything. Instead, there was a shared commitment to authenticity. They approached their craft with patience, allowing moments to unfold rather than forcing them into perfection. That patience translated into work that felt honest and grounded, resonating with those who recognized themselves in its imperfections. Beyond their professional interactions, each continued to invest in causes and communities that reflected their values. Keanu remained drawn to spaces where attention was minimal, but impact was real, offering support without spectacle. Sandra, similarly, focused on initiatives that prioritized human dignity over visibility. These choices were not coordinated, yet they mirrored each other, reflecting a shared belief that meaningful change rarely announced itself. As word spread quietly through the industry, perceptions began to shift. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily. People who had once questioned Keanu's decisions started to recognize the consistency of his character. They saw that his choices were not reactive, but rooted in principle. Sandra's renewed sense of purpose did not go unnoticed either. Her work carried a depth that critics could not easily dismiss, grounded in lived understanding rather than surface emotion. Neither of them sought vindication, yet it arrived in subtle forms. A project that resonated deeply with audiences. A conversation with a colleague who admitted being inspired to set firmer boundaries. A letter from someone whose life had been touched by a story they helped bring to life. These moments did not erase the pain of the past, but they reframed it, revealing its role in shaping something more enduring than temporary success. What became clear over time was that purpose, once lost or obscured, did not always return through grand revelations. Sometimes it re-emerged through alignment, through the quiet confidence of knowing that one's actions matched one's values. Keanu had not chosen pain to be admired. Sandra had not accepted support to be saved. Both had simply acted in ways that felt right, even when the cost was high. As this chapter drew to a close, there was a sense of steadiness that neither had known before. Not certainty, but trust, in themselves and each other, and in the belief that kindness practiced quietly could reshape lives in ways fame never could. The world continued its relentless pace, but for them, the noise no longer dictated direction. Purpose had returned not as a destination reached, but as a path they now walked with intention. When strength became a shared language. By the time the world began to fully settle into a new rhythm around them, Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock had already moved beyond the need for explanations. What once felt like an open wound in their lives had transformed into a quiet point of understanding, something neither of them needed to revisit constantly in order to honor. Pain, after all, does not disappear simply because time passes. It changes shape. It integrates itself into who a person becomes. And for both of them, that pain had become a shared language, one spoken not through words, but through choices, restraint, and an unwavering respect for one another's humanity. Keanu noticed this transformation most clearly in moments that seemed ordinary on the surface. Conversations no longer carried the weight of what might be misunderstood. Silence no longer felt like something that needed to be filled. He had learned that true strength did not require constant defense or justification. The decision he had made months earlier had recalibrated his internal compass so thoroughly that doubt rarely lingered for long. When uncertainty did arise, he no longer fought it. He examined it, listened to it, and allowed it to guide him toward clarity rather than fear. Sandra experienced this same evolution in a different way. Her confidence no longer depended on approval or reassurance. It came from alignment, the sense that her actions, values, and intentions were finally moving in the same direction. She felt less pressure to perform resilience and more permission to simply live it. The industry, once a place where she had constantly navigated expectations, now felt more manageable because she had learned where to draw her boundaries. Those boundaries were not walls, they were markers of self-respect. When their paths intersected again in a more sustained way, It was not driven by nostalgia or the desire to prove something to the world. It was driven by mutual trust. They approached collaboration not as an escape from the past, but as a natural continuation of growth. There was an ease between them that could not be manufactured. It came from having witnessed each other at moments of vulnerability and choosing not to exploit what they had seen. Observers who worked alongside them sensed something different, even if they could not articulate it. There was no tension, no unspoken competition, no need to dominate a space. Instead, there was balance. Decisions were made thoughtfully. Disagreements were handled with respect rather than ego. Each gave the other room to exist fully without expectation or obligation. This dynamic did not make their work louder or more dramatic. It made it honest. Keanu, reflecting privately, recognized how rare this kind of connection truly was. In a world that often rewarded urgency over understanding, he found value in patience. He had learned that choosing pain over glory was not a one-time act of courage, but an ongoing commitment to integrity. Each day presented new opportunities to compromise, to take shortcuts, to protect comfort at the expense of conscience. And each day, he chose awareness instead. Sandra, too, carried forward the lessons of the past in ways that influenced everyone around her. She became more attentive to the emotional climates she entered, more deliberate in how she offered support. She no longer underestimated the power of quiet advocacy, of standing beside someone without overshadowing them. Her gratitude toward Keanu did not manifest as indebtedness, but as a renewed dedication to living with intention. There were moments, rare and unspoken, when they both felt the weight of what might have happened had a different choice been made. Had Keanu chosen glory, the story would have looked very different. It might have been easier, cleaner, more socially acceptable. But it would have come at a cost neither of them wished to pay. That awareness did not bring regret. It brought perspective. It reminded them that the paths worth walking were rarely the ones most applauded. As time passed, the narrative surrounding their lives softened further, losing its sharp edges. New stories replaced old ones. Public attention drifted, as it always did, toward whatever was loudest or most convenient. Keanu and Sandra did not resist this fading focus. They welcomed it. Privacy, once something to be defended fiercely, now felt like a natural state of being. Within that privacy, they found space to continue growing as individuals rather than symbols. The true impact of Keanu's choice revealed itself not in headlines, but in ripples. People who had witnessed his decision began making quieter, braver choices in their own lives. Not because they sought recognition, but because they saw proof that it was possible to act with compassion without being destroyed by it. Sandra, through her work and presence, reinforced that message, showing that dignity did not need to be loud to be powerful. What united them most strongly in this chapter was not shared pain, but shared resolve. They both understood now that resilience was not about enduring hardship indefinitely. It was about learning when to stand firm, when to step back, and when to protect what mattered most. Strength, they realized, was not something one person carried alone. It was something that could be shared, mirrored, and reinforced through trust. As they moved forward, there was no sense of arrival, no final triumph to celebrate. Life continued, imperfect and unpredictable, but beneath its uncertainties ran a steady current of purpose. Keanu Reeves had chosen pain to protect another human being. Sandra Bullock had accepted that protection not as weakness, but as a reminder of shared humanity. Together, even when walking separate paths, they embodied a truth that would endure far longer than any moment of glory. That empathy, once chosen, reshapes everything it touches. The legacy no one saw coming. In the end, the true measure of what Keanu Reeves had chosen could not be found in restored opportunities, softened opinions, or even renewed respect within the industry. Its meaning revealed itself much more quietly, unfolding over time in ways that resisted easy recognition. Legacy, Keanu came to understand, was not something declared at a podium or etched into awards. It was something built invisibly, moment by moment, through choices that aligned with one's conscience even when no one was keeping score. And this realization, more than anything else, defined the final chapter of the journey he and Sandra Bullock had unknowingly begun together. Years after the controversy had faded into memory, people still approached Keanu with stories that surprised him. Not stories about films or performances, but about moments when they themselves had faced difficult decisions. They spoke about choosing honesty over advancement, compassion over convenience, silence over self-protection. Many of them did not mention his name directly at first. They spoke instead about witnessing an example that had shifted something inside them, about seeing proof that dignity could survive even in environments that seemed designed to strip it away. Keanu listened to these stories with humility, never claiming ownership over lessons others discovered for themselves, yet quietly acknowledging the ripple effect of his choice. Sandra experienced a similar unfolding in her own life. As time passed, she noticed how her presence began to invite deeper conversations, how colleagues felt safer expressing uncertainty or vulnerability around her. She had not set out to become a symbol of anything, yet by honoring what she had learned, by refusing to diminish herself or others for the sake of ease, she created spaces where authenticity could exist without fear. The support Keanu had offered her years earlier no longer lived as a single event. It lived on through how she treated others, how she showed up fully without needing to dominate or retreat. When they reflected privately on the past, there was no romanticizing of hardship. Neither of them believed suffering itself was noble. What mattered was choice. Pain had been unavoidable once the decision was made, but it was never the goal. The goal had been protection, integrity, and the refusal to let fear dictate behavior. That distinction mattered deeply to both of them, because it reminded them that resilience was not about enduring harm endlessly, but about choosing values that made endurance meaningful. Their relationship, whatever name the world might have tried to give it, existed now beyond definition. It was not sustained by constant proximity or public affirmation. It was sustained by trust earned under pressure and preserved through time. They did not rely on each other to complete what was missing. Instead, they recognized in each other a shared commitment to live honestly, even when honesty complicated things. That recognition did not fade, it matured. As their careers continued, both Keanu and Sandra found themselves gravitating toward stories that reflected this hard-earned wisdom. Narratives where strength looked ordinary, where courage appeared in restraint rather than domination, where kindness was not portrayed as weakness but as resolve. Audiences responded to these stories not because they were sensational, but because they felt real. In a world overwhelmed by noise, authenticity had become its own quiet force. The greatest irony of Keanu's decision was that by stepping away from glory, he redefined it. Not for the industry at large, perhaps, but for those who paid attention. Glory, he demonstrated, could exist in absence. It could live in the moments when a person chose not to speak, not to defend, not to preserve status at another's expense. It could exist in the willingness to carry discomfort so that someone else might walk a little lighter. Sandra often reflected on how that single act of protection had altered her understanding of strength. It taught her that strength was not always self-generated. Sometimes it was shared, offered freely, without expectation. And sometimes the bravest response to such strength was not to repay it publicly, but to honor it privately by living differently because of it. As the years went on, the story itself became less important than what it represented. It no longer mattered who had been criticized or vindicated, who had stepped back or moved forward. What mattered was the enduring truth beneath it all. That empathy, once chosen, reshaped lives in ways no spotlight ever could. That perseverance did not require applause. And that kindness, practiced consistently, left marks deeper than fame. In quiet moments away from the world's gaze, Keanu Reeves knew that the pain he had chosen had not diminished him. It had clarified him. It stripped away illusions and left behind something sturdier than reputation, self-respect. Sandra Bullock knew the same. The experience had not defined her by vulnerability, but by growth. Together, without needing to stand side by side for the world to see, they carried forward a legacy built not on spectacle, but on humanity. And so the story ended not with a triumph that could be photographed, but with lives lived more truthfully than before. In choosing pain over glory, Keanu had protected more than one person. He had protected an idea, that it was still possible to act with empathy in a world that often rewarded indifference. That idea lived on quietly in choices made by people who might never know his name, but who felt the impact of his example nonetheless. That was the legacy no one saw coming, and it was enough.